Hey everybody, great class today. As promised, I'm posting this lecture this evening for you to review before Thursday's class. In Thursday's class, then, as usual, we will spend the time discussing the points that I'm raising here and in the Berkey. I wanted to wait until now to post this lecture because I wanted to refer directly to some of the things that we did in class, and I'll be doing that, as you'll see, in the lecture to come. So our subject for Thursday's class is the Umayyad period. So this is just a short period, less than a century long. And of course, this is when some of the ends of the conquest, important parts of the conquest happen. I want to focus on both the key caliphs, but also some of their opposition, some of what we call fitnas in Arabic, the different kinds of civil strifes that we have during this period. And then we talked in class about some of the coins. I'll mention that again, but I want to focus here in this lecture on architecture, again, as another source for us to understand this history. It might be helpful for us to put all of this into a bit of a schematic. So to think about this early period, this is entirely what we've been talking about last week and this week, ranging from 610, so that's roughly at the time of Muhammad's preaching when he first began to receive the revelations in Mecca, up until 750, which is at the end of the Umayyad period. So within this, we have the life of Muhammad, we have the four Medinan caliphs that I had mentioned before, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. I'll be referring to them again, as well as the Umayyads in Damascus. Now, you'll note here that I'm dating the Umayyads in Damascus from 640 up until 750. Traditionally, you'll see 661 to 750, but the fact is that when Ali was killed in 661 and Muawiyah took over as caliph of the Muslims, he had already been in Damascus for 20 years. So this important shift from Medina as the capital to Damascus happens, but Muawiyah was already there. We'll be talking more about this in just a minute. And then we'll be looking at the Abbasid period for the final week of this overall review of history. That then, in terms of the conquest, involves the Umayyads over in Spain. So this very same dynasty that was in Damascus escapes, travels to Spain, and then establishes, in fact, a much more successful dynasty over in Spain during this period when their rivals, the Abbasids, are on the throne in Baghdad. Very quickly, the Abbasid Empire falls apart. The question was whether it was really a complete empire to begin with, but certainly we have North Africa. We've got Spain peeling off, North Africa peeling off, and then Egypt in 969, with the rise of this very important Fatimid Empire. So again, that's our agenda for next week. We have already looked at these conquests, but this map is helpful for you to see sort of how this all unfolds over time. Again, this red section is a bit of a generous way of looking at the Islamic world during Muhammad's time. The conquest happened right away under Omar, the second caliph, into Iraq, into Syria, into Egypt. So this fundamental fall of the Sassanid Empire happens at this point, as well as the loss of these major territories for the Byzantine Empire. It's under the Umayyads then that this expands farther east and farther west. So east into Afghanistan, Herat, and Kabul should be familiar sites to you by now, as well as west then, Kairouan, and then across. Again, maps lie. Virtually nobody lives in this part of what's really a very dry desert area. It's only the coast here in North Africa that receives regular rainfall, and that is where the population is. The press into Andalusia happens, and then famously, as I've mentioned before, right here, the Battle of Tours in 632. So that's the farthest extent of this Muslim conquest into France. They stay in the southern part of France for quite some time. And as I mentioned before, this area then becomes the site of the Umayyad kingdom and eventually caliphate in Spain. So these coins we addressed in class and talked quite a bit about them. I thought it was an excellent discussion, really well done. Once again, now that you have this, so you can look at this, these in the middle are examples of Byzantine on the top and then Sassanid on the bottom, coins from before the conquests. And then the ones on the side are the same issues after the conquest. So you get an idea of what's happening to the iconography in these different places. Coins, as we said, are a bit tricky because they represent really the central governmental view of what religion should look like to others. So we have a hard time arguing from coins to anything like popular religious practice. Nonetheless, there are a lot of very clear guideposts that we have through coins. We certainly can be impressed by the fact that some semblance of the cross and very clear fire altars remain on these coins, even during the full period of the four rightly guided caliphs and well into the Umayyad period. And then, as I said, this reform of the coins, you still have Berkey focusing on the role of Abd al-Malik in this reform. And Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, he's one of the three Umayyad caliphs that I think you should know. A tremendously important figure for a variety of things. My argument is that what he's doing here on these coins is actually in response to the Umayyads, and I'll talk about them in just a minute. Nonetheless, this change in the coins is significant, and we need to pay attention to it. The words that are put on these coins for public consumption, as some of you pointed out already in class, this is a kind of propaganda, a kind of public statement about what religion is and the relationship of the state with religion. Now, I have to pause for a second and mourn the loss of this coin. What you're looking at here was actually a coin that I owned. I had it in my office. Somehow, whether somebody took it or it's lost, I don't know. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I lost this coin. So really sad. But the fact is, you can pick up a coin just like this on the open market. I think I paid about $200 for it. So see what you can find. Now, this is the triumphal view, right? The first four rightly guided caliphs, the extension of the Islamic world into the former Sassanid and much of the Byzantine empires. But there's another story, and this story is also told by the Muslim sources, and it's the story of fitna, of these internal strifes that are happening alongside this triumphal story. We begin back in the period of these four rightly guided caliphs. The third of them, Uthman, is assassinated. Well, Omar is assassinated too, but this one's different because Uthman is killed actually by a group of other Muslims. These are Muslims who are unhappy with Uthman's caliphate for various reasons. I'm not going to go into all those details now. We can certainly discuss that if you're curious. But they came to Medina and attacked him in his house. The story goes that Uthman had his Quran open on his lap, and while he was reading, several of them stabbed him together, putting their hands on the single knife so that the blame would be spread among all of them. Be that as it may not surprise you, there are copies of Uthman's Quran with bloodstains in various locations around the Muslim world, most notably in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. You can see that if you travel to Istanbul today. So Uthman's assassination, again, is this real clear sign of internal strife. 656, this is just 24 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. But notably, right, after much of this territory has been taken, there's a great deal of wealth that's pouring into Medina, and this wealth is being distributed among people according to set formulae. Again, this is something we can talk about a bit, the Diwan, if you're curious, lots of interesting details there. But the result is that some people are in and some people are out. And it's these people who are on the outside, are not part of the ruling class, who are upset about this. Ali ibn Abi Talib is the son-in-law as well as the nephew of, cousin of the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Talib is Ali's father, also the Prophet's uncle. So you have an idea of how they're related. He, by many accounts, was one of the first believers in Islam. Everybody agrees that Khadija, the Prophet's wife, was the first believer. Ali was certainly among this early group. He was passed over many times for caliph, was not named as caliph among the first three, but now finally he agrees to be caliph. He was not directly involved with the assassination. There's no evidence to that. But the very fact that he agreed to take on the caliphate after Uthman's assassination was a cause for the first fitna. So in other words, it's not just Uthman's assassination, but everything that came afterwards that is the strife we're talking about. On the one hand, we have important companions of the Prophet, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, as well as Talha and Zubair, go out and actually undertake an armed conflict against Ali in what is called the Battle of the Camel, because of the camel that Aisha rode upon as she was cheering on her side. Very colorful accounts of these things in the Muslim sources that we have today. And then there is Muawiyah. So again, Muawiyah was Uthman's cousin. He had already been named 640 as the governor of Damascus, and he simply refused to accept Ali's position until Uthman's assassination had been investigated. So Muawiyah was a really clever character. We've got lots of information about him. But as a result, Ali is reigning over this period with a broken system where he has a lot of opposition from Uthman's relative in Damascus, from companions of the Prophet, as well as from his own followers. So Ali is assassinated in 661, 5 years later, by these Kharijites who were part of the people who followed Ali and went into battle against Muawiyah and his forces along with Ali. Now, the Kharijites, the reason the Kharijites were upset was because Ali and Muawiyah agreed to go into diplomatic discussion to solve their differences. The Kharijites thought this was ridiculous and undertook a campaign of assassination. They killed Ali. They were successful in that one. They tried to kill Muawiyah, ended up killing one of Muawiyah's generals. And then the important general, Amr ibn al-As, who was the ruler of Egypt at this time, a very wealthy and important province, also was attempted to be assassinated. He was just wounded in that process. So this group of the Kharijites then are a political group, part of Ali's retinue, and then opposing this negotiation between Ali and Muawiyah. They turn into a religious sect, and so are sometimes thought as the first religious sect. There are some interesting differences they have compared to either Sunnis or Shi'is. Shi'is don't exist yet. We'll come up to them in a second. But this relationship of politics and religion is not something new here. This is part of this Kharijite group, actually still around today, and located, there's a group located in North Africa and in some other places. So this is the beginning of that Kharijite sect. The beginning of Shi'ism in some ways then comes up in 680. And what happens here is that Muawiyah, who is this first Umayyad caliph in Damascus, instead of doing the traditional Arab thing of bringing the elders together to name who the next leader is going to be, he designates his son, Yazid, to be the next caliph. This is the claim of kingship that Berkey is talking about, because in the traditional Arab mode, the notion was there weren't kings, rather it was a kind of democracy where the big important men of the area would get together and determine who the leader was going to be. There were a number of people who did not like this transfer, but among them was the Prophet's own grandson, Hussein. The Prophet's grandson, Hussein, this is the son of Ali, right? So his grandfather was the Prophet. His father had been assassinated nearly 20 years earlier. And he opposes Yazid's naming to the throne. And in Iraq, outside of Kufa, a place called Karbala, is where he met with Yazid's forces. He had only about 70 followers, we're told, and was utterly slaughtered in the field. So the killing of the Prophet's grandson is, as Berkey said, it's a small issue in terms of warfare, only 70 followers, but in terms of the history of Islam is tremendously important. For Shiites, this event in 680 is still very much commemorated today, and commemorated in spectacular fashion. If you're curious about this, just Google a little bit Karbala and Hussein, Muharram, and find out some of the events. There are millions of people who come to southern Iraq, to Karbala every year to mourn the death of the Prophet's grandson. So hugely significant in terms of the religion of Islam. And then finally, the revolt that I think is so important in terms of the politics of the Umayyad state is the revolt of Abdullah ibn al-Zubair. Now, note that Ibn al-Zubair is the son of Zubair, who was one of the companions who resisted Ali's being named caliph. So he is of an old family in Mecca and Medina, and for over 10 years controls Mecca and Medina, and refers to himself as a caliph. It's not only Mecca and Medina that he's in control of, he's actually in control of much of the eastern provinces up into Iraq and modern-day Iran and all of that. The Zubairids are at various times in control of those territories as well. And here is where we see the first change in the coins that I had mentioned. It's actually under the Zubairids that iconography of the Sassanid period with the fire altars and the visage of the emperor, yes, with a beard, so he's an Arab, but still it's the emperor, the face of the emperor and the fire altar, that is taken away and replaced with similar pious statements that we have in the coin reform a few years later under Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. So Chase Robinson, a professor at the City University of New York, has argued, and I certainly agree, that this change that's happening with the Zubairids was probably the impetus for the change that we see under the Umayyads. And one of the things that's interesting about this and Berkey mentions this as well, is that that date is 692, when Abdullah ibn al-Zubair and his revolt are finally crushed by the Umayyads, Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, is the very date of the building of the Dome of the Rock. We'll talk about that in just a second. So the Umayyad dynasty of Damascus, yes, 660 or 661 or 640 up until 750. First, we have Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who is caliph then for these 20 years. He is not only the cousin of Uthman, the third caliph, he is also the brother-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Very interesting, Berkey talks about this continuation of Arab tribal concepts into the early Islamic period. All of the first 5 caliphs are related to the Prophet Muhammad by marriage. All of the first 5 caliphs are related to the Prophet Muhammad by marriage. And so Muawiyah is also, he's a companion of the Prophet, is part of this story, and yet he is the one who is seen as the establishment of this new dynasty. Damascus here is very important. It's the reason why I put this on the map, on the quiz, because the shift from Medina to Damascus is indicative of a, if you will, a Byzantization, Byzantization, figure out your own word, of the early Islamic movement. What I mean by that is that a lot of what we see, and we saw this already in some of the correspondence we looked at, the continuation of Greek and in the diplomatic correspondence and tax receipts, the adoption of these coins that is very similar to what Byzantine coins looked like. The whole turning, if you will, west toward Byzantium, one wonders whether the Byzantine Empire might have eventually absorbed the Umayyad dynasty into its fold. Because the fact is that the differentiation between those local Christians and these new Muslims was not really that significant. There's a lot of things in the Quran that speak very highly of Jesus, for example. So Muawiyah is an interesting puzzle and a very important figure, a transitional figure for us to pay attention to. Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, definitely a key figure in the Umayyad dynasty. He is the one who is given credit for reforming both Arabic as well as the coinage. My question as to whether this is really Abd al-Malik's work or whether he's simply smartly responding to things that are happening elsewhere in his world, specifically Mecca and Medina and the revolt of Abdullah ibn al-Zubair. And then the third person that I want you to know is Omar ibn Abdulaziz. I mentioned very briefly by Berkey as the pious Caliph Omar. Now we've got 2 Omars, right? There's Omar ibn al-Khattab, the second Caliph, and there's Omar ibn Abdulaziz, this Umayyad Caliph. You can talk about them as Omar I and Omar II, if that makes it easy for you. Omar ibn Abdulaziz, lots to say about him, but what we want to remember in terms of Islamic history is that he was trying to address this question of these new converts to Islam. So we definitely see a significant movement within the Umayyad period. Muawiyah, who was not reforming coinage, was not building monuments, who for all intents and purposes seemed to try to get along with his Damascus Arabs and the Arabs around him, who were mostly Christian. So from there, we move to Abd al-Malik Marwan, this very significant break from Christianity, this establishment of a kind of a public face for Islam. And then Omar ibn Abdulaziz, because of the success, there were all these people converting to Islam who were supposed to pay an extra tax. And the way that the taxation system went is that Muslims did not pay this tax, non-Muslims did, but new converts were required to continue paying the tax that they paid when they were non-Muslims. Obviously, if this continued on apace, there would be a lot less flowing into the treasury. But Omar, because he was interested in the spread of Islam, wanted to give these new converts the same treatment as other Muslims. He's also credited with beginning collections of these hadith reports. We talked about the hadith briefly in class. These are the narrative accounts, not just of the Prophet Muhammad, also of the Prophet's companions, of many events that happened during the Prophet's life, and then things that happened afterwards. So we've got hadith that are accounts of the reign of Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman. Those are all passed down to us in these packets of story that we call hadith. I can talk more about that in class if you're curious. But the actual collection of these really began under Omar when he set up a secretary to begin this work. So let's talk about this Dome of the Rock. Again, Abd al-Malik Marwan, there are a variety of different possible interpretations for this. Here's the building itself. As Berkey points out, it's not a mosque. It's not really possible to pray, or you can pray anywhere, but there's no qibla. There's no clear designation of what the direction of prayer is. Rather, the architecture forces you to do something when you walk in this door, and that's to circle around the large rock that's in the middle under the dome itself. It's a spectacularly beautiful building. The exterior that you see, those tiles, those are a later addition from the Ottoman period, but still really gorgeous. And the inside, the mosaics here, this is typical Byzantine work. And this is the reason that architectural historians have said that there were Byzantines who helped design this and who also worked on this. So this is interesting to think about, that this first significant Muslim building is actually probably being built by Christians. The inscriptions on the inside are quotations from the Quran. And so in effect, this becomes our first clearly dated representation of the Quran. We have manuscripts that are older, but those are dated by other means, things like carbon dating, which has a large range and can be questioned. Whereas the dating of the Dome of the Rock, 691 or 692, I apologize for that. That's the difference in Hijri versus Miladi dating. The dating of the Dome of the Rock is quite clear. There are so many possibilities here as to why Abd al-Malik built this building. One suggestion is that it was an alternative pilgrimage site. Since Abdullah ibn Zubair had control of Mecca, there was no Hajj, no pilgrimage to Mecca. So did Abd al-Malik build this in Jerusalem to provide an alternative, another place to go on pilgrimage? It is in the very site of the Holy of Holies. Is this some kind of celebration of Judaism, or is it a supplanting of Judaism? The statements inside the dome are clearly, and they're quoted in the Berkey book, they're clearly opposed to Christianity, clarifying, if you will, the Christian perspective on Jesus. So there's a great deal to learn from this monument, and we can talk more about this in class. The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus was built a little bit later, after Abd al-Malik's death, and it's a very important structure that was built on the foundation of St. John's Cathedral. So St. John the Baptist we're talking about. His head is apparently still there. And this cathedral in the middle of Damascus was where Muslims also worship. So now this is interesting, right? Because again, Muawiyah is in Damascus from 640 on. We've got from there until 715, so that's 75 years when Muslims are worshiping with Christians at the Umayyad Mosque, at the St. John's Church, until the mosque itself is built. And the structure of the mosque, you can see, still mimics that old Byzantine basilica style of the cathedral that used to be there to begin with. In the courtyard, you have this gorgeous structure on the left. That's the treasury, again, covered with beautiful Byzantine mosaics, which are also found on the interior of the mosque. And then these two enormous wings that separate right to left, because Muslims pray in rows, in long rows. Now, they do not face the pulpit or the altar. They pray all in these long rows, all facing the one direction, which is Mecca. So the structure is purpose-built for Muslim prayer, again, very different from the Dome of the Rock. Lots to talk about in terms of the fascinating Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. And then the third piece I just want to show you in contrast is the Sidi Oqba Mosque in Kairouan, Tunisia. Supposedly its foundation goes all the way back to 661. We have no evidence of that whatsoever. What we do have is the 10th century structure, almost utterly intact from that period. Really hardly has changed at all. Many, many interesting things to talk about this. First of all, look at the prominent minaret, which was a part of mosque structure at this point. The Umayyad Mosque has little corner minarets, which are very, even hard to discern. Whereas this is structurally very, very clear. And you will see this unique kind of box minaret as part of the architectural expression of Western Muslims, all the way out into Morocco and then up into Spain. Many examples of this. And then you can also make out in the arcade, perhaps, that there are columns here, double columns, and those are all spolia. Those were all taken from old Roman structures, which were found throughout North Africa. In fact, in the big stones here at the bottom, at the base of the minaret, you also see stones with Latin inscription on them, some of them upside down, which is an interesting choice. I mean, they surely knew which way was up. And incorporating it in upside down is sort of a claim of authority, it seems to me, anyway. So let's reflect just a bit on what Islam was like under the Umayyads. Remember our difficulties of understanding these sources. The literary sources tell us all about these different rivalries. And of course, none of these, Shiism, Kharijism, Ibn Zubayr, none of those won, right? The Umayyads won. So that's what we consider to be Islam today. But we should consider what it would have been like if Kharijism was the defining element of Islam, if the Kharijites had won, and they were the ones who determined what this new religion would look like. In terms of Shiism, we in fact have many examples of Shiites in control and Shiite dynasties, the Fatimid being the largest and most spectacular of these, but many other examples as well. So I don't want you to think of Shiism as a sect of Islam, as if Islam is this thing and Shiism is just a heresy, right? But rather as these as different possible expressions of Islam, one of which was very successful, the Sunni version, another of which Shiism, still 10% of Muslims today are Shiites. And then the role of religion as justifying the political dynasty, the way that religion did that in the Byzantine Empire, the way it did it in the Sassanid Empire, and the continuation of this concept under the Umayyads, and as we'll see, under the Abbasids as well. The evidence, then, we look at architecture and papyri. We have many questions, but certainly we do see this move toward repeating some of the themes that were previously there, not a complete erasure of the past in many ways, but an incorporation of this past in unique ways. And I want to bring to light something that I'll be talking about in my book, and we can focus on it. This is a tombstone found in Aswan, Egypt. That's Upper Egypt, near where the Aswan Dam is, about almost 100 years ago. And this tombstone is really important for a variety of reasons, but precisely because it does not represent the state. It is not an attempt to justify a dynasty. It is rather a private expression of grief over the death of someone who dies right about the same time that Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan is reforming the coins. And so we have some really interesting expressions in this that we'll be talking about. Suffice it to say that if we're looking for non-public expressions of Islam, we can also find those. The question is, what do we as historians think is valuable? What do we think the story is that we need to tell? And finally, to think about this difference between the hadith, that is to say these packets of story, and what's called sunnah. So sunnah is understood as an authoritative aspect of the Islamic tradition, authoritative in the way that the Quran is authoritative. But frankly, which sunnah are Muslims supposed to follow? Is it the sunnah of the caliph? Is it the sunnah of the Prophet's family? Is it the sunnah of the town of Medina? There were various people who argued for these. The shift that we see in the 9th century, as I'll talk about next week, is the shift to a more textual authority. And this is the rise of the religious experts, otherwise known as the ulama, who take all of this and weave it into a tradition that in many ways puts them in the position of determining what is and what is not Islam. So again, that's quite a bit of material. There is a lot more to unpack, and I look forward to discussing this with you in class on Thursday. See you then.